So we'll move into our study today. Initially, I thought we'd do the whole of chapter 14, but it's a pretty large chapter, so I thought I'll split it into two parts. The first part we deal with today, which is verses 1 all the way to 23, and we'll take up the rest next study. So before we get in, some background, focusing especially on 1 Samuel chapter 8 to 13. In 8, we saw how Israel wanted a king. But we know that when the Lord led them out of Egypt, he had announced that he was their king. So when Israel wanted a king to be like the nations around them, they were in a way rejecting God as their king. Yet God actually picks a king for them, though he knows that it's not the right person at the right time. He still picks someone, and he in every way sets Saul up for success. He anoints him, he leads him, he empowers him by his Holy Spirit, he equips him in every way. And we saw how some people doubted that Saul was the ideal king. Yet, by the Lord's hand, Saul had a great victory over the Ammonite king. And by that, he wins over all the doubters also. So now Saul, in every way, is anointed as king, both in the minds and hearts of the people as well as in the presence of the Lord. But when Saul comes under pressure, we understand why the Lord had initially had not wanted Saul to be their first king, because he buckles under pressure. Under pressure from the Philistine army, we saw how Saul relies on his own judgment and reasoning rather than obeying the Lord's commandments. We saw last time how he was of weak faith, how he was lacking in true knowledge of the Lord, and how, in short, he was not the man after the Lord's own heart. And we also saw, to make matters worse, how Saul kept justifying his actions instead of admitting his errors and being disciplined. Okay. And for his disobedience and weak faith and his inability to learn, the Lord rejects Saul as king. We saw last time how clearly Saul was not the man after the Lord's own heart. But Saul, when he was rejected as king, the Lord had not rejected his people because they demanded a king, right? So he, through Samuel, the Lord announces to Saul as well as to Israel that the Lord had already picked a man after his own heart who would be king in place of Saul. When Saul's reign ends, there would be a king who would not be from Saul's family, but it would be a man after his own heart whom he had chosen. And we all know who that is. That's David. So we will study about David later. Before that, we have to spend some more time with Saul and understanding some of the weakness of his character and what we can learn from that. Okay. So today's portion, verses 1 to 23 of chapter 14, we can look at it as a study in contrast between the character of Saul and his eldest son, Jonathan. Okay? We should see how the text uses the context, what Saul is doing, what Jonathan is doing, the situation in which they are, how they're responding it. All of this, if we read carefully, brings out the contrast between the two, between the faith of Saul and the faith of Jonathan. Okay? We see how, while we study today, how under the shadow of the Philistine threat, Saul, though he is the king, the leader of the people, was found sitting under the pomegranate tree. So the scripture uses the words very symbolically. He was found sitting when he should have been up and about and leading. Whereas we see Jonathan going over to the Philistine garrison, right, to take the battle to the Philistines. And then both in today's portion, we'll see Saul and Jonathan has somebody accompanying them. For Jonathan, it's his armor bearer. And we are told about the loyalty and the courage of the armor bearer and how he acts as an affirmation for Saul, for Jonathan. Whereas Saul, the person who's mentioned along with Saul, is Ahijah, a priest, right? And we notice that we will see why Ahijah comes into the picture and what the significance of it is for Saul. But the interesting thing is, Ahijah is introduced by name and lineage all the way to the fact that he is the grandson of Eli and the sibling, the brother of Ichabod. If you remember from chapter 4, Ichabod was a very turning point in the history of Israel. And that's why he was named Ichabod. I don't know whether it's Ichabod probably. The word Ichabod meant the glory had departed. So by even bringing out Ahijah to the picture and describing him through his lineage, there's a reference to how Saul is in the same state now. His glory has departed, right? And then we see how Jonathan, acting on his faith, has a test to see how God would influence the events for him. Okay, So he's not doubting God, but he's just wondering how God is going to lead him. And while Saul, on the other hand, is using ritual objects of faith, the Urim and the Thummim, which are in the ephod of the priest. He's trying to use these ritualistic methods to determine God's course of action, his own course of action. Okay, so Saul is trying to choose between safety. Should I just stay quiet, sit under the pomegranate tree, or should I lead my army to battle? Whereas Jonathan has already decided what he would do, and he only needs to know how the Lord will lead and influence the outcome. So from the contrasting faith, this one is a study in the contrasting faith of Jonathan and Saul. And we will see how the faith of both has an impact on the larger community. It has an impact on the unbelieving Philistines. It has an impact on the unfaithful Israelites and on Israel at large itself. So the key verse, Jonathan has a statement here, which is the key verse in today's study, which is verse 6. He tells the armor bearer, nothing can prevent the Lord from delivering, whether by many or by few. So that's one of our key, the axis on which our study today will rotate. Okay. With that, let's focus on the first part, that is verses all the way till 7. So here, I already talked a bit about it. We will look at what are the textual portions that describe Saul and Jonathan. There is something told to us about Saul, what he is doing, something told to us about what Jonathan is doing. And when we look at all of this and the context that was there in the previous chapter, the context is Saul is rejected by God. He is also seemingly not able to inspire his people because his army has abandoned him. He's only left with 600 people. They have all retreated to Gibeah, which is Saul's hometown, the safety of his hometown. And the Philistines are boldly raiding Israel from multiple directions, and Saul is doing nothing about it. This is a context in which this first 7 verses are set. So when you read the first 7 verses, compare what we are told of the actions of Saul and Jonathan. What can we learn about the people? So God has picked both, right? Saul, we saw how he picked him in chapter 8 to be his king over his people. What can we learn about the people the Lord acts through from the contrast in their characters? Okay, so look at Saul, look at Jonathan. The Lord is acting through both of them, right? He has acted through Saul and he is unable to use Saul any longer. He's acting through Jonathan now. So study their characters and see why is it that the Lord can act differently through Jonathan than from how he can use Saul. Okay, so that's the first question. So let's look at the context, right? The context from which we can derive some understanding of Saul as well as Jonathan's behavior, their faith. So first, Saul, we know, relies on his own wisdom. And we saw that in the last chapter, right? And so in his wisdom, he chooses to disobey the Lord's unambiguous commands. And therefore, he's rejected both by God and his people. Why do we say that? Because Saul's army has deserted him. Only 600 poorly armed and demoralized soldiers remain with him. And in the midst of the ongoing raids, Saul places himself in a position of comfort and safety. He's sitting under the pomegranate tree. So the word sitting is used. It's because it's like you can visualize it. When he should not be there, he should be elsewhere. He should be moving about, leading his people. Then Saul's priest Ahijah is a sibling of Ichabod, whose birth signified the glory has departed. So even and that's the reason why the extended lineage is also mentioned when Ahijah is introduced, because it is symbolic of Saul's current fallen state too. The glory has departed from Saul also, right? And what are the results of Saul's lack of faith in the Lord? First, Jonathan loses confidence in his father's ability to lead. Why do we say that? Because we are told in verse 1 that he does not even let his father know that of his plans, right? Second, the army is so demoralized that Jonathan even keeps his plans from the army because he is unable to trust them. Because if he trusts them that he is going to go out and go and challenge the Philistines, there's a chance that they would actually probably lock him down or something. So we can see all of this is the effect of Saul's lack of faith in the Lord and his inability to lead them any longer. And then Saul, remember, was someone who prophesied by the power of the Holy Spirit. It meant that God spoke through him. And yet this Saul now cannot even hear the voice of the Lord. He cannot hear and discern the leading of the Lord. He has to rely on ritualistic symbols. The reason why Ahijah is there is because he brings the ephod, and in the ephod is the Urim and the Thummim, which are objects that are used to try and determine what the Lord wants whenever there's a question before them and they're not sure of which way to go. They would use the Urim and the Thummim to try to decide. It was a way of casting lots. Okay, so we see so much, right? All of these are manifestations of Saul's lack of faith and the consequence of his lack of faith. Whereas Jonathan, when we look at Jonathan, we see Jonathan launching out in faith. So much so he places himself in a vulnerable and difficult position. His faith moves him to action rather than accept the status quo. I think Manu was the one who said that, right? He says, come, let's go over. Compare this to Saul sitting under. So Jonathan wants to get up and go over, take the battle to the Philistines. Okay. And then he's aware. It is not that he's a foolhardy person. He's not militarily, that he's very naive militarily. He's aware of the disadvantages that he has, right? He knows, we are told, that he has to pass, to reach the Philistine camp, he has to pass through a valley kind of place, and which has these rocky encroachments on both sides, right? And we know that there's probably a Philistine sentry post out there. They are positioned on top of the rock. So Jonathan is aware of his disadvantages when he has to get up and go over to the Philistine camp. But does this mean that he is very foolish and just like a rash guy? Not really, right? His courage is not foolhardy. Because he is knowing, we are told he knows that he is going up. The courage comes from the fact that he knows he is going up against the garrison of not just Philistines, but against the garrison of the uncircumcised men. What's the significance of that? What is the sign of circumcision? What's the significance of circumcision? The circumcision is a visible sign of the covenant Israel has with its God. So Jonathan is seeing himself going against not just any enemy, but against, he sees himself as a person who has a covenant relationship with God, and he's going against someone who's outside this covenant, right? So that's where his courage comes from. And he has a good perception of how God will empower his people, because he says, nothing can prevent the Lord from delivering, whether by many or few. So he has that faith. He knows that the Lord can achieve. It's not through numbers, but even by a few, right? And what are the results of this faith that Jonathan has? We see that he's a real leader. Why do I say that? Because he has a good perception of God's plan for his people and his role in it. Because he has moved, he has come out of this comfortable position. He knows that he is part of a covenant with the Lord, and he knows that the Lord's role and purpose for his people, Israel, is not to be subject to people who are outside the covenant. It is to occupy Canaan, right? And to be a model nation, right? So God is inspiring. Jonathan's faith is inspired by God. And this faith that he has now inspires his mind and his action, his thinkings, and the way he acts, right? It is not just Jonathan alone and his actions that are inspired by his faith. Even his armor bearer is inspired to risk everything to follow him, right? Even his armor bearer is clearly knows the challenges that are ahead of him. Not only that, he even knows that he is being asked by Jonathan to disobey the king, right? So yet we see the armor bearer is so inspired by Jonathan's faith that he gives his absolute loyalty even against the odds, right? He tells Jonathan, you do what your mind tells you to, right? And I will be right with you. I'm right with you. And then when Jonathan acts on faith, so what do we see? When Jonathan acts on his faith draws to him others that will affirm and support his faith journey. And this is true of all people who act on faith, right? When you act on faith, the Lord will bring to you others who will affirm your faith and support your faith journey. So that's something we can learn from this first portion. With that, let's move to the second portion, which is verse 8 to 15. In this portion, The key thing is Jonathan is proposing a test. The question is, what is he testing? Right? The test, it can look like the test that Jonathan is proposing probably should have only one right answer. Should I go up or should I stay here? But if you read it in the full context of what Jonathan says before the test, we will see that the test that Jonathan is offering has really no wrong answer choices. Both the answers, whichever he has to do, are going to be right because the Lord is going to act through either of them. So focus your attention on Jonathan's action. One thing, I'm sorry, if we focus our attention only on Jonathan's actions, we will risk missing something about how the Lord acts through Jonathan, his chosen instruments, right? We see that the Lord is going to use Jonathan as a lever. What is a lever? It's something that magnifies the force applied on it, right? So the Lord is going to use Jonathan's faith as a lever to magnify his power and manifest his strength to all of the Philistines as well as all of Israel, right? So look at this portion carefully and see, what does Jonathan's test reveal about his faith? How does Jonathan's faith become a channel for the Lord's name to be glorified? Okay, so that's the next question. Look at the test carefully. What does it reveal about its faith? Second, and how does that faith become a channel for the Lord's name to be glorified before the Israelites and the Philistines? At least in this portion, it's before the Philistines first. Okay, that's the next question. So the question is, Jonathan's test, what does it reveal about his faith? How does Jonathan's faith become a channel for the Lord's name to be glorified? So by normal conventional military wisdom, Jonathan is clearly at a disadvantage here. He has to go through a pass with rocky cliffs on both sides. The enemy seems to be stationed, from reading the rest of the portion, we know the Philistines are stationed themselves on top of this rock, right? So look at Jonathan's situation. If he stays on the ground, what are the two choices in his test? Either stay on the ground and wait for the Philistines to come down to them, or wait for the Philistines to challenge them to go up to them. So if he stays on the ground, they are vulnerable to the enemy attacking from above. In any battle, the high ground is always an advantageous position, right? And even if you take the weapons of those days, probably spears and arrows, I don't know whether Jonathan had arrows, he probably had a sword and a spear. They were less effective when you're propelling them upwards. The sword is not at all effective unless you had someone to engage in close quarters, right? So their weapons were useless or ineffective if they were on the ground. Whereas on the other hand, whoever is on top, their weapons become more effective, right? Now, if they had to climb up, they would have to crawl up the rocks. How do you do that? You have to use your hands and your feet. And you're totally vulnerable and defenseless while you're climbing up. So both these choices, are not in favor of Jonathan, right? But one thing we know is, before Jonathan applies the test, he has already stated his purpose. See, Jonathan's purpose and his faith are very clear. His course of action is decided before he lays out the test. Twice in verse 1 and 6, we are told, Jonathan says, come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost to the other side. So he has already decided what his course of action is. Second, he even knows what the result is, right? Because in the last portion, in verse 6, if I remember, 7, in verse 6, when he tells his armor bearer, come, let's go over to the outpost of these uncircumcised fellows, perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. So the perhaps is not actually an indication of doubt, but it is like saying, either we fight this battle or the Lord's going to intervene on our behalf. Perhaps the Lord will intervene on our behalf. Even if he doesn't, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving us, even though we are few. Even though we are few, even if we were many, or even though we are few, which is the fact now, the Lord will deliver. So that is Jonathan's this one, and his statement of purpose. That's a statement of his faith. It is after this that he tells the armor bearer, here is a test. I'm not sure what we should do. Let's look at what the Lord will guide the enemy to do, right? He's relying on the Lord to guide the course of actions that will deliver him. He already knows God's going to deliver him. So he says, God is going to cause the enemy to determine our choice, right? So the test is, should we go up or should we stay here? Both of them seem like bad choices, right? We saw why before. Of the two choices, the tougher one is climbing up, right? So in Jonathan's mind, what does he say? If the choice that the enemy gives us is to come up to them, that is, they've made the tougher choice for us. We are going to do that. So in Jonathan's mind, the greater the obstacles, the greater the deliverance. Because he says, for in that case, that is, in case the enemy challenges us up to come, challenges us to take on the more difficult option, in that case, it is a clear evidence that the Lord has given them into our hands. So the greater the obstacles, the greater the deliverance. So this leaves no doubt in Jonathan's mind, it is not by our strength or our might, but it is the Lord's doing. So that's what this test, Jonathan's test, reveals about his faith. Clearly, he sees that one way or the other, the Lord will deliver. If it's a greater obstacle we have to overcome, the Lord's greater deliverance will take place, and it will leave no doubt. It will leave no doubt that it's the Lord's doing. Okay, and so how does Jonathan's faith become a channel for the Lord's name to be glorified? So to act on faith, Jonathan now has to make himself visible to the enemy, right? So till now, they were probably approaching undercover, because in verse 11, we are told that, so both of them, Jonathan and his armor bearer, now showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. And then what happens when they make themselves visible to the enemy? As soon as Jonathan steps out in faith, visibly in faith, the enemy's first action is to mock and taunt him. The enemy says, look, the Hebrews who scattered and went and hid in the holes and in the bushes and in the caves, they're coming out of their holes in which they have hid themselves. So they're taunting him, they're mocking him, right? The next course of action of the enemy is to challenge Jonathan's resolve and wisdom. They're challenging Jonathan, come up so that we can teach you a lesson or two, right? Come up. Let me see whether you have the guts to come up and challenge us by climbing up, right? So first, the enemy taunts him. Second, the enemy challenges their resolve and wisdom, right? And in the presence of the enemies of God, the Philistines, we see God's name glorified. Jonathan sees a larger purpose, because it's interesting to note that twice we were told in verse 12, I'll just read verse 12. I'm sorry, in verse 12, the last portion. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hands of Israel. Earlier, when he says that, in verse 10, he says, tells his armor bearer, here is the test. If they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be a sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. And now when this happens, Jonathan suddenly has a larger vision. He sees the larger purpose that the Lord is using for him for. So he sees that he is going to be an instrument for the deliverance of Israel at large now, because he's saying the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel, not just us. Okay, so we are instruments acting on behalf of the larger, for a larger purpose. Then second is, God protects Jonathan and his armor bearer while they were most vulnerable, right? We are told that they had to climb up using their hands and their feet. So their weapons are probably strapped to their back. And we see God protecting. So, and think of the Philistines at this point. They're not just waiting and watching, but they're seeing that whatever they are doing, the spears, the arrows that they're throwing, is not touching Jonathan and his armor bearer. So God's glorifying his name. In the vulnerability of Jonathan and his armor bearer, God's name is being glorified, right? Then we see that when Jonathan goes up, after this exhausting climb, Jonathan has the strength to still take and strike down the enemy, to go against the enemy. So we see that clearly it's Jonathan's strength is empowered by the Lord. So the Lord's name is glorified. Why do we say that? Do the Philistines also think like us? That is actually, it is true, because when we read last verse 14 and 15, we are told the Lord now takes Jonathan's individual act of faith and he multiplies its result beyond just the half-acre battlefield, right? This whole encounter is happening in an area of around 20,000 square feet. But the Lord takes what is happening here and he multiplies its force. Because we are told in verse 14 and 15, the fear of the Lord overwhelmed those who are in the camp. So even those who are far away in the main camp, those who are in the battlefield, those who are in the raiding bands, who are nowhere in this half acre, are filled with the fear of the Lord. So clearly, Jonathan's act of faith God has taken that and multiplied it and glorified his name. And there is no doubt in the minds of the Philistines also, leaving no doubt in the minds of the Philistines that the Lord has intervened on behalf of Israel supernaturally. And the catalyst was Jonathan. Okay. So with that, we'll move to the last portion and our last question. The Lord, in verse 23, we are told, delivers his people. It's almost like Jonathan predicted in verse 6, nothing can prevent the Lord from delivering, whether by many or few. And in verse 23, we are told the Lord delivered Israel that day. Okay. And in this portion, Saul is back on the scene. Okay. He's being handed a victory that he neither earned or fought for. If you look at this portion, we'll see some more reasons why we were told that Saul was not a man after the Lord's own heart. Why Saul is not growing in faith, right? So it is not just Saul. In this portion, we should also look at the rest of the Philistines, right? The panic in the Philistine camp has a deep impact, not just on the Philistines, even on the rest of the Israelites, particularly with the Hebrews who had abandoned Israel and joined up with the Philistines, right? So we see the influence of, in the last portion, we saw how the influence of Jonathan's action extended to the entire Philistines, those whom he physically encountered, as well as those who were in the camp, in the battlefield, and in the raiding parties. Here we will see how the effect of Jonathan's action has an impact on Saul. It has an impact on the Hebrews who abandoned Israel, as well as the rest of the Israelites. Okay, so that's a question we have to look at. How did the result of Jonathan's faith influence the faith of the rest of Israel? Okay, that's the last question for us to look at. Okay, so shall we just get into this question? How did the result of Jonathan's faith influence the faith of the Israelites? We saw how it affected the Philistines last time, right? While Jonathan and his armor bearers step out in faith, what were the Israelites up to? We know from the last chapter, most of them had run away and they had hidden, right? We know from this chapter, some of them had even gone and sided with the Philistines. They had betrayed the Israelites and were serving the Philistines. We know that Saul was demoralized and he was sitting under the pomegranate tree, right? He had taken refuge in Gibeah, his comfort zone. When Saul is alerted that the enemy is fleeing, what is his first reaction? His first reaction is again to assess his situation. He's relying on his senses and what his eyes and ears tell him to decide what to do. So Saul, again and again, we see is a man who's acting on his own wisdom. With the exception, first he checks, is all my army still there? One way is to figure out, is Saul trying to figure out, hey, why did this Philistine suddenly start fleeing? Did someone cause it? That could be one way to read the text. Another way to read the text is the Philistines are fleeing. Saul is seeing that and he's saying, do I still have my 600 people with me? So he takes a count to figure out whether all his people are still there or has he lost more of his army. So the question is, does Saul actually realize that Jonathan is the catalyst for the current situation? We are not told whether that is true or not. We can only guess. Going by what we know of Saul, I think perhaps not. He does not realize that Jonathan is the catalyst. He's more concerned about, hey, I think I'm getting the upper hand. Do I still have enough people with me? And that's why he's assessing how many of his army remains with him. So Saul is initially, even then, unwilling to act. He still needs more affirmation, right? So he falls back on ritualistic affirmation. He calls a priest, get the ephod here. He wants to use the Urim and the Thummim to try to decide what should be his course of action. Contrast this with Jonathan, right? Jonathan is acting because he was sure of the Lord. And it was the Lord he knew who would guide the outcome. Saul is trying to figure out by his own wisdom, by the evidence of his eyes, ears, and ritualistic things that he knows of to determine his course of action. So see what people are relying on. Saul, what he relies on to determine his course of action, and Jonathan, who relies on his knowledge of the Lord to determine his actions. Okay. And when the evidence of Saul's eyes and ears tell him that surely the enemy is in panic, Saul decides to act finally. He decides, oh, okay, there's sufficient evidence. I don't even need to consult the ephod anymore. So he tells the priest, take your hands off, right? So contrast the mind of Saul with the mind of Jonathan. Remember the armor bearer's words. So Saul's mind needed a lot of affirmation from his senses, from what he saw, what people told him. Whereas Jonathan's mind was a mind that was resting in this knowledge of the Lord. That is why the armor bearer told him, do everything that is in your mind. Do as you are inclined. So that's a difference between Saul and Jonathan. And the impact of Jonathan's faith also. And when we look at this a little further, the Lord takes Jonathan's individual act of faith and multiplies its result beyond the half-acre field. We saw that already, right? He extended that to the entire Philistine army, threw them into panic. The fear of the Lord struck the Philistine army. It is not just them. The act, Jonathan's act, the result of his act, has even propagated into the hearts, minds, and the spirit of the rest of Israel. Because in verse 19, we are told, finally Saul picks up the courage to enter the battle. Right? So this is also a result of what Jonathan has triggered through his faith. Then the Hebrews that had abandoned the Philistines, it must have required a special kind of knowledge for them to abandon their allies, because they allied with the Philistines because they thought they were stronger, to abandon them and to come back and join Saul and Jonathan. It must have required a strong amount of affirmation for them. So that's another impact of Jonathan's faith, the multiplying effect of Jonathan's faith, right? And if we are even told the fleeing and the hiding Israelites, people who are fleeing are now seeing the Philistines fleeing, and they come back and pursue the Philistines, right? So it has impacted all of Israel that has fled and hidden, right? It has restored their courage. Then the faith and confidence of Israel at large is restored, we see, right? So that simple step that Jonathan takes, simple, not in terms of, it's simple in terms of the steps that he had to take, not in terms of what he had to encounter to take it. But those steps, see the impact it has on what it means for Israel at large. How the Lord could take those small offerings of faith and multiply its effect so that he could deliver his entire people, right? So we see how that through Jonathan's action, his prediction comes true, because the Lord has used the effect of that to deliver Israel today. And we see that the Lord has not just delivered Israel from the Philistines, he has also delivered them from their fear, from their cowardice, and from the poor leadership. So while Saul's leadership is not inspiring them, he brings Jonathan in the front so that his leadership will now inspire Israel. Okay, so through that we can see how small actions, the Lord can take small things that we can offer and actually multiply it. So this is so close to the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000, right? That's a miracle that is in all the four gospels, I'm sorry. So if you read Matthew's account of this gospel, there's something very interesting. We see Jesus had great concern for the people. He taught them, he healed them. He also wanted to feed them when he saw that they were hungry. And when he wanted to feed them, you know what Jesus commands his disciples? He tells them, you give them something to eat, right? So he's asking these disciples, what do you have to do? You give them something to eat, right? And this command is echoing through the ages. It's the same call that Jonathan had heard from the Lord. You do something here. You step out and take the battle to the Philistines, right? So this is true, right? In all our faith journeys, sometimes it may be your direct experience, or it may be through the experience of somebody's faith that inspired you. We have seen a lot of evidence how the Lord can take a little that is offered willingly and can multiply it and glorify his name through it. So through the discussion, the 10 minutes that we have, I was thinking it'll be a good time to share any experience that you have where the Lord has multiplied what you have and glorified his name, or experience of others you know. So that's the question. That's what I thought we could share in our smaller groups. So I think we are out of time. So just to close, the verses I'd like to leave you with is, I think you should go and read Matthew chapter 14, verse 16 to 20. That's just that portion. Just pick some of the words, right? We have only 2 loaves, and first Jesus telling the disciples, you give them something to eat. The disciples saying, we have only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus saying, bring them to me. And then he multiplies it. He looks up to heaven, gives thanks, and blesses that little offering. And then he multiplies it. And they all ate and were satisfied. And there was leftover for the others. There was leftover also, right? Reminds me also of, it so reflects on what Zechariah was saying, not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. Who are these great mountains ahead of you? I'll make them all a plain. That's what he promised Zerubbabel. Yep, as the exiles were returning back to Israel. So just leaving you with those thoughts. Next week, we'll take up verses 25 to 52, and we meet again on 7th March. Thank you.